Good afternoon again. I know it's been a long afternoon so far, but we're getting to the real meat, actually. We've had much analysis of the issues that are headlined by this at this conference, and I think now we will get some account of what our congressmen think we can do about it. It's a pleasure to welcome to this panel Congressman Brian Fitzpatrick. Congressman Fitzpatrick represents Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District, and he serves at the present, I think, on the House Foreign Affairs Committee, as well as the Committee on Homeland Security. But he brings to his work in Congress a wealth of experience, having served for some 15 years with the FBI, and where, for better or worse, he became intimately acquainted with the problems we are here to address, and not only within this country, but in the world at large. We're also happy to have with us Congressman Pittenger, representing North Carolina's 9th District. Congressman Pittenger is serving his 3rd term in the U.S. House of Representatives. He serves as Vice Chairman of the Subcommittee on Terrorism and Illicit Finance, where he provides leadership on efforts to intercept the money used to finance radical terrorism, a most important subject and one which we have not yet talked about a great deal today. As chairman of the Congressional Task Force on Terrorism and Unconventional Warfare, Congressman Pittenger has met with hundreds of world leaders and security experts to advocate increased global cooperation in the fight against ISIS and radical Islamic Jihad. It's really a pleasure to have you both here this afternoon. And in a way, the questions I have to address to you are very, very simple, but I'm sure the answers are difficult. First, we've had an analysis of the kind of challenge we're faced with in a general sense in terrorism, but its specific enablers, Iran, the Muslim Brotherhood, other agents, places where, like Qatar, where radical Islamist movements find some shelter and comfort and support. There are certain large things that sometimes get to be done with planes and ships and soldiers, but all of that depends upon the support of our public and the Congress that represents it. And I guess, again, as I said, my questions are pretty simple. Where do you think we are today? You're both experienced men in the struggle, and how do you see our situation today? And what do you think we should be doing, and what is the best way in which the Congress can support that effort, including, and I understand that you both have some legislative proposals that have been developed to address these issues. Want to start, Congressman Pittenger?
Sure. Well, good afternoon. Good to be with each of you all today. I'm Congressman Robert Pittenger from North Carolina. I do serve on the Financial Services Committee, and I chair our Congressional Task Force on Terrorism, an effort that I took over from our former Majority Leader, Eric Cantor, if he asked me to succeed him. And our interest has been to bring collaboration together among members of Parliament from throughout the world, addressing issues like terrorism finance, cybersecurity, and intelligence sharing. All three of these are important factors in defeating our adversaries. To that end, we've hosted 8 forums to date that have involved 600 members of Parliament from 60 countries. We're having our next forum in Argentina, Buenos Aires, that will be in November, and they expect 300 people there from throughout South America. And then we'll have another one here in Washington, D.C. But members from our own government, from Treasury, the private sector, B of A, Citi, Barclays, and other private sector groups, SAS, Ericsson, are involved with us and giving tools to our partners and what they can do to work with us to stop the flow of the money and enhance their cyber capability efforts, as well as making sure that we have good data resource sharing. Data is very critical. I have read countless numbers of documents in our SCIF under classified briefing of so many of attacks have been prevented because we had good data. And certainly as we look at the field and see who has been complicit, Iran is, of course, at the top of the list. Right next to them, of course, is many other countries like Qatar, who has been a resource for individuals to find a safe haven to be there. Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, of course, involved in 9/11, but they have been involved in ransoms for kidnapped people, funding through various grants and nonprofits, entities. I've had 3 meetings with the Emir, with the ambassador several times. Frankly, with the Emir, he even said to me, Congressman, we have helped al-Qaeda in Syria because of his disdain for Assad. And I said, well, what are you going to do with al-Qaeda? He said, well,
Right.
I'll deal with that later on. But to his own admittance, they'd been engaged and involved in supporting the terrorist groups. So stopping the flow of the money is critical. We have a very capable technology that we want to resource and work with our partners around the world. We have our embassies who still lack staff. I just had a bill passed to enhance the staffing of our embassies to make sure that their attachés are better trained and equipped, and other foreign governments are as well. I do have a data sharing bill that we're working on right now that allow financial institutions to share data with each other. They all operate out of their own silo, and to be able to know where the money's flowing, they need to be able to share this data. And yes, ma'am. And to have a safe harbor to be able to do that. That's not available today. So I'm working with members of the Financial Services Committee to get that done. If you know Maxine Waters, we'll put in a good word. She's a nice lady. We have a very, very good relationship. So anyway, those are my opening comments. I appreciate your concern on these issues. I feel like they're absolutely vital. To the extent that we can stop the money, we can have good data, we can enhance our cyber capabilities, are all very important tools in defeating our adversaries.
If I may just ask before I
Sure.
turn it over to Congressman Fitzpatrick, of the variety of things that you described as important in this fight, it's the financial data sharing that you think is the most crucial at this point?
Well, that's an important tool. Right now, 90% of the foreign money that comes into our country comes in through 4 financial institutions, and yet they are restricted on how they can share data with each other. And when Treasury has some awareness of some bad guys, we want to know what they're doing, we want to have as good and complete a data sharing as we can. Obviously, we're all concerned about privacy and civil liberties. We address that at every single one of our conferences. The White House Council of Civil Liberties also participates in these forums, as does our Chairman of Judiciary, Mr. Goodlatte. But sharing data is very critical, and we must have it and must continue to have it in whatever enhanced way we can.
Thank you. Congressman?
Thank you, sir. Thank you to the Hudson Institute for inviting both Mr. Pittenger and myself. My name is Brian Fitzpatrick. I represent Pennsylvania's 8th Congressional District. I'm in my freshman term. And my job previous, leading up to this, was for the past 14 years, I was an FBI supervisory special agent working really all aspects of national security, counterterrorism, counterintelligence, cybersecurity, and also worked international corruption matters, which also feeds in to the national security picture. And I think it's critically important that Mr. Pittenger and myself are working together hand in hand. He, as in his role on the Financial Services Committee on the task force to combat terror financing, and myself being both on the Homeland Security Committee and the Foreign Affairs Committee, which also work hand in hand in this problem. And I know I'm not telling anybody in this room anything you don't already know, that in a point in time where we have 190 95 countries on this planet, there's not a single one that I'm aware of that's safer, more stable, more secure now than it has been in the past. And nowhere is that more prevalent than in the Middle East. Part of my FBI experience, I was in Iraq as part of Operation Iraqi Freedom, where I served as an al-Qaeda interrogator. And I was reminded in my most recent trip to Israel, meeting with the folks in the IDF, people in the intelligence services, how significant and how imminent the threats are that they face over there, which just strengthened my resolve as a member of both Homeland Security and Foreign Affairs, and as a member of the entire body of Congress, that we need to be very honest about our relationships across the world, but also in the Middle East. We need transparency. We need to be honest about who our friends are and who our friends are not, and allow that to influence the decisions we make with regard to foreign policy, because we live in a very dangerous world, and we need that honesty and transparency so we know that people that claim to be our friends and say one thing to our face and then do something else behind our back that are undermining not only our security concerns, but also credibility issues. That's a very significant problem that has a ripple effect throughout a whole host of other areas. So just want to thank you for inviting us. Look forward to the discussion.
I guess the main follow-up that arises from what you both said is this: in what way do you think, well, in a way, following on your comment, Congressman Fitzpatrick, that the management of our relations with countries in the Middle East and so forth is left something to be desired in certain cases. What do you think the direction we should be headed? And that I don't mean to exclude you from this.
I think first and foremost, transparency. We need our leadership to be honest about relationships and all that's involved there. Who our friends are and who they're not. And Mr. Pittenger brought up Qatar. It's very important for us to have an honest conversation as a country, and certainly on the floor of the House and the Senate, about what exactly is going on over there in terms of their media outlets and what they're portraying over their media outlets, whether or not they're supporting and harboring members of Hamas and other illicit organizations. And as far as their financing goes, Mr. Pittenger talked about the importance of cracking down on international illicit money laundering. That was one of the main priorities of the National Security Branch of the FBI. Money is the lifeblood of terrorism. And if you cut off the illicit money laundering, you cut the head off of the snake, and that is really the key ingredient to fighting back on terrorism. And if there's instances in Qatar or elsewhere in that region of people that are claiming to be our friends that are still either turning a blind eye or, in the worst case, actually supporting behind our backs the flow of international money laundering throughout the region and throughout the world to fund organizations that are hostile to the national security interests of the United States, that's a conversation we need to have on the floor of the House of Representatives. It's a conversation we certainly need to be having on the Foreign Affairs Committee, on my subcommittee, which covers the Middle East and North Africa.
Was there something you wanted to add about that?
Well, sure. I would think that having honest relationships is critical. We have now a memorandum of understanding the State Department has with Qatar today. It's a classified document. I will be briefed by the document. I didn't have time to be briefed before I flew in today. But I will see it. I would like to know, frankly, why it's even classified. But to that end, we need to have clear and open relationships and understandings with our would-be allies. As I have sat down with every head of state in the Gulf region, they all have questioned, frankly, the feckless foreign policy that we've had over the previous 8 years. And they didn't know where America stood, and particularly on the Iran deal. The Crown Prince of one of the countries said to me, Congressman, you know, it's like the Arab states went to Moscow to negotiate an agreement relative to Ukraine without talking about that with Europe. So we need to be clear thinking on our allies in the Middle East, as well as recognize that there's been bad actors who have operated out of each of their countries, and we need them to be straightforward. Of course, many of the countries now have come out with their own memorandum against Qatar, and I respect that, but we need frankly, to expect accountability from every country. While I have focused on Qatar, I have similar issues with some of the other countries involved as well.
It does seem, experience in the Middle East tends to show that unless you're very clear about where you stand, people will either misunderstand you or take advantage of you. And I can't help but agree that for the last 8 years, there was not a real clarity about where we were headed. The question is, are you confident we will have clarity now?
Well, I think the world knows where we stand today, and I pay tribute to President Trump for making that clear. Frankly, when he ran for president, you heard all the clamoring, well, the Muslim world will never pay any respect to him. And here 50 countries came to Riyadh to sit down and listen to him. That's a pretty major statement. So I think the world has a clear perspective from the U.S. And I bring that back to, frankly, Ronald Reagan. Ronald Reagan gave a clear understanding of where America stood, and he energized the rest of the world. He and Margaret Thatcher worked together. We built up our military. We put sustained economic pressure on the Soviet Union. Pope John Paul even got involved and had a rally in Poland yelling, we want God. But there was a whole world participated. As a result, the Soviet Union collapsed without firing a shot. Well, how's that? Somebody doesn't like what we're saying.
I guess not.
So I think we need to have that type of clarity, and I respect and honor the President for being clear in what he's communicated to the rest of the world. It's moral clarity. The world does not expect America to show up everywhere, but the world is a safer place when America is strong and we stand strong. And that's where we need to be today.
One other large issue, obviously, that will be an issue for the Congress concerns the JCPOA, otherwise known as the Iran nuclear deal. With the lack of, the President just most recently declined to certify that Iran was in compliance with the agreement. It seems to me for entirely good reasons they're not in compliance. But the question is then, that is supposed to lead to a legislative process or as part of a legislative process. What do you think, what's your either recommendation or expectation of what will follow from this? I think last week, General McMaster was saying that, quite rightly, that the decertification was an operation not between the United States and Iran, but between two branches of the American government, the President, the Office of the President, and the Congress. So something now would presumably get set in motion and within the Congress. Yeah.
Yeah, there's really two questions with regard to the Iran agreement. Number one, was it wise to enter in to begin with? And number two is what to do now. I've said repeatedly I thought it was a huge mistake to enter into that agreement. There's not a single government official in Tehran, not a single member of the Iranian parliament that signed that agreement. By all measures, they're violating it with regularity. And we've already sent, here's the issue, we've already sent, I believe, about $150 million in previously frozen assets and given them access to that again. And the lifting of sanctions is allowing their economy now to grow at a clip of 10 to 12% beyond what it was before. So those are not good things with a country that is unanimously referred to as the largest state sponsor of terror. The question is, what do we do now? And that's really where our committee is going to have to do a deep dive into what are the consequences, both intended and unintended, of withdrawing from that. And I think that's where the hearing process is going to come in. We need to hear from the experts on what the implications would be, and we need to make an informed decision.
The withdrawal, I think this is sometimes not entirely well understood, but as far as I understand, and I did read the agreement rather closely a few times, when we decertify, we're not simply withdrawing from the agreement, but the question is whether that leads to the reimposition of sanctions, which Iran would then obviously regard as a break in the agreement. Is the process now to, that I understood you to say, House Foreign Affairs will now hold hearings about what it might do with regard to sanctions? Is that essentially where we're at?
We need to it's one thing to have a bad decision be made in the first place. The question is now, what is the best course of action? And that's what we need to decide on as a committee. And in order to make the best decision, we need to have full and open hearings and hear from all sides on that.
Well, the horse is out of the barn. I mean, they received back $150 billion. We paid them $12 billion just to come to the negotiation table. Iran now is positioned with trading alliances with various governments. There is still some reservation by some of the banking system. They do have about 30 banks who are able to operate under SWIFT concurrence, that they can still engage with other financial institutions in the transfer of money. So that clearly is a concern to me and something that I believe could be done to address and restrict the flow of money from the financial institutions. I think sanctions are still warranted. The reality is, we took an agreement, and in 15 years or less, they're free to do whatever they want to do.
Yeah.
A very short mindset. Hard to understand that these people think in terms of centuries. I mean, they don't. We think in quarterly reports, and us 15 years is a long time. That's not a bother to them, even if they stayed in full compliance. They are a major threat to the world, and we cannot keep our eyes off the fact that the ongoing development of nuclear weapons is likely. We can't even visit their military installations. The IAEA cannot visit them. So it's filled with major concerns of whether they are going to be accountable.
We have a couple of minutes left. I want to say before and I turn it over entirely to you, but I want to say that despite the lack of light, physical light, you've been very illuminating about the problems we're discussing, and also about the Congress's role in this. So if you have any final statement you wanted to make.
Yeah, no, I just want to reemphasize, and I can just give you the freshman legislator's perspective. We're obviously dealing with a lot of very significant, serious issues in the coming months that will have a direct nexus and link to our national security here at home, to Israel's national security and the stability of the region. And what I always like to tell folks is, please let your voices be heard. The fact that you're here today, giving up of your time to engage in this conversation, tells us two things. Number one, you're obviously care enough about this issue. And second, you're obviously very educated because you're giving of your time to be here. Let those voices be heard. Come to us, particularly those on the Foreign Affairs Committee, people who are working on the terror financing aspect of this. It's really a two-pronged fight when it comes to cutting off illicit money laundering and making wise foreign policy decisions, particularly with regards to the Middle East. And we want to hear from you. We need to hear from you. I'm coming out of 14 years in national security of the FBI, but I'm learning every day more and more being on that Foreign Affairs Committee with Chairman Royce. And we're entering a very critical juncture right now, without a doubt. And we need to hear from you. So I just want to leave you with that. Feel free to reach out to us directly. We're happy to sit down and talk.
I'd like to thank the Hudson Institute, extraordinarily important gathering. I commend each of you for being here. We are faced with enormous challenges ahead of us. I think we all are aware of that, and frankly, that's why you're here today. Our Committee of Financial Services is zeroed in on the illicit transfer of funds, as well as my overall broader interest, as I said, in building a collaborative relationships with members of Parliament throughout the world. So any advice, input, direction that you've got, we welcome it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And on behalf of the Hudson Institute, I'd like to thank you for being here today and giving up your valuable time as well. Thank you.
They said I had a radio face anyhow. So.
It was